A five-star restaurant, a powerful Japanese billionaire CEO who looked right through his black waitress like she wasn't worth a second thought. So he did what men like him always do. He spoke freely in Japanese, mocking her, humiliating her, certain she couldn't understand a single word. What he didn't know was that she heard everything, every word, from the very first sentence. And when she finally responded, in his own language with a calm that cut deeper than any outburst ever could, the entire room went still. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The kind of restaurant that makes regular people feel small doesn't advertise itself with neon signs or sidewalk boards. Aurelius sat tucked inside a glass tower in downtown Chicago, its entrance marked by nothing more than brushed bronze lettering and a pair of doors that opened only when someone decided you were worth letting in. Inside, the ceilings stretched high enough to make conversation feel intimate and grand at the same time. Chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls, catching light from every angle, scattering it across white tablecloths and polished silverware. The guests who filled those tables wore the kind of calm that only came from never having to worry about a bill. It was the kind of place that hummed with money, not loudly but constantly, like a current running beneath everything. Moving through it all, quiet and unhurried, was Amara Cole. She was 26, slim and composed, with dark eyes that took in everything and gave away nothing. Her uniform, white shirt, black vest, dark trousers, was pressed and clean, the same as everyone else's. But the way she wore it was different. There was no stiffness in her spine, no nervous energy in her steps. She moved like someone who had made peace with her surroundings, even if those surroundings had never fully made peace with her. Most of the guests didn't look at her twice. The ones who did look expected nothing much. A girl working a double shift, maybe saving up for something, maybe just getting by. That was the story people wrote for her without asking. She let them write it. What they didn't see was the way her eyes tracked a glass the moment it dipped below the halfway mark. They didn't notice how she rerouted herself mid-step to avoid a collision before anyone else in the room even sensed one coming. They didn't catch the way she listened, not just to what people said, but to how they said it, the pauses between words, the shift in tone when someone moved from content to irritated. She processed the entire room the way a conductor keeps track of every instrument, quietly, without applause. She had been at Aurelius for 14 months, longer than 3 of the 4 people who'd been promoted above her. Her co-workers were a mixed group. There was Danny, 23, fast-talking and anxious, always one mistake away from spiraling. There was Priya, who handled private dining and had a gift for flattery that the older guests loved. And there was Gerald, a senior waiter in his late 40s who'd been at Aurelius for over a decade and had developed the particular brand of smugness that came from surviving long enough in one place to feel ownership over it. Gerald didn't dislike Amara. That would have required him to take her seriously enough to dislike. He simply looked past her, the way you look past furniture, acknowledging its presence without granting it any real weight. That Tuesday evening, with the dining room already half full and the kitchen running at a steady clip, Danny approached Amara near the service station, a laminated menu card in hand. "Hey, quick question." He flipped the card toward her and pointed to a line near the bottom. "How do you even say this one? Table 4 keeps asking about it, and I don't want to mangle it in front of them." Amara glanced at the card. And it was a French-style preparation, beurre blanc, served with the pan-seared halibut. "Beurre blanc," she said, clean and easy, barely slowing her pace. "The second word is nasal. Don't let the C trick you. It's silent." Danny blinked. "Where did you—" But she was already moving, 2 water glasses balanced in her hand, weaving toward a table near the window without looking back. He stared after her for a second, then mouthed the pronunciation to himself and went back to table 4. A few minutes later, the kitchen doors swung open, and Marco, the sous chef, stuck his head out and caught Amara's eye. He waved her over with 2 fingers, his signal for something specific. "Table 9 asked for the kaiseki-style amuse-bouche," he said, keeping his voice low. "Problem is, the prep crew plated it the Western way again. Off-center, a garnish on the wrong side." "I know. Amara had already noticed it on the pass. Can you replate before I take it out? The garnish should sit at 10 o'clock, not 6, and the portion needs to face the guest, not the server." Marco looked at her for half a second. "You know the kaiseki plating guidelines?" "I know this dish." She left it at that. He turned back to the kitchen without asking more questions. 2 minutes later, the plate came out correctly. These were the small moments that made up Amara's evenings. Small corrections, quiet adjustments, things that smoothed over problems before they became visible. Nobody announced them. Nobody thanked her for them. They simply disappeared into the flow of a well-run service, unattributed and unnoticed. She preferred it that way. At 7:45, the energy in the restaurant shifted, and it was subtle, a tightening in the air, a change in the way the front-of-house staff moved. The manager, a trim, silver-haired man named Robert Hale, emerged from his office in the back and walked the floor with the particular precision of someone who'd been briefed and was now bracing. He spoke quietly to each section's lead, then gathered the full floor staff near the service corridor. "I need everyone focused tonight," he said, his voice low but carrying. "We have a VIP reservation at 8, single party, private table. His name is Takahashi, Kenji Takahashi. He's a CEO major, the kind of visit that gets talked about in boardrooms." He paused and looked around the group. "He has connections to a group of investors currently in discussion with the ownership of this restaurant chain. That means tonight is not just dinner service. Oh, tonight is a performance review for all of us." The staff exchanged glances. Priya straightened her posture. Danny's jaw tightened. Gerald smoothed his vest with both hands. "No mistakes," Robert said. "I want the best table service this floor has seen. Anticipate everything. Disappear when you're not needed and materialize the second you are." He looked briefly at Amara, not with uncertainty, but with the particular consideration of someone running a mental calculation. "Amara, I'm putting you on Takahashi's table." Gerald's head turned slightly. Amara gave a small nod. "You're the steadiest server I have," Robert said, as if preemptively answering a question no one had asked aloud. "Just do what you always do." She didn't say thank you. She just nodded again and went back to her section to finish the prep before the reservation arrived. B at 8:07, the front doors opened. Kenji Takahashi walked in the way powerful men tended to, not loudly, not with display, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had never needed to announce himself because rooms had always arranged themselves around him. He was in his mid-50s, lean, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for his exact measurements. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples. His face was composed and pleasant in the way a mask could be pleasant, everything arranged correctly, nothing giving itself away. Behind him came his assistant, a young white woman, late 20s, with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her name tag read Claire. She moved efficiently, her eyes scanning the room once as they entered, then settling back to a professional neutral. 2 other men followed, both in suits, both carrying the slightly compressed energy of people who dealt in large numbers and slept lightly. Corporate executives, clearly. The kind who didn't come to dinners like this to enjoy the food. Robert met them at the entrance and guided them personally to the reserved table near the back of the room, semi-private, set slightly apart, with a clear view of the restaurant, but enough distance from neighboring tables to create the impression of seclusion. Amara watched them settle from across the room, her hands busy folding napkins at the service station. She took them in piece by piece. Takahashi sat with his back to the wall, deliberate, instinctive. He didn't open his menu immediately. He looked at the room first. His eyes moved methodically across the space, touching each table, each face, each exit. When it was the survey of someone who assessed before he engaged. Then his gaze passed over Amara. It didn't stop. She was part of the background, furniture, as far as he was concerned. She picked up the menus and walked to the table. "Good evening." Her voice was warm, but measured, no excess in it. "Welcome to Aurelius. My name is Amara, and I'll be looking after your table tonight. Can I start everyone with still or sparkling water?" Claire looked up with a polite smile. The two executives gave the brief, distracted acknowledgement of men who were still mid-conversation. Takahashi didn't look at her. He was reading the menu as if she hadn't spoken. "Still water," Claire said. "For everyone, I think." She glanced at Takahashi for confirmation. He gave a slight nod without lifting his eyes from the menu. Amara went to fetch the water. As she turned and walked toward the service station, there was a sound from the table, low, unhurried, in Japanese. A comment, brief. Something murmured between Takahashi and one of the executives. Amara's step didn't falter, but just for a fraction of a second, barely long enough to mean anything, barely long enough for anyone watching to be sure they'd seen it, she paused. Then she kept walking. The water was poured, the menus were in hand, and by all appearances the table was moving through the usual rhythms of a high-end dinner service. But something beneath the surface of that table had already curled into a different shape. Kenji Takahashi set his menu down and leaned back slightly, the posture of a man who had decided something. He said something to the executive on his left, Yamada, who had been introduced during seating, with a brief nod, and the two of them exchanged a glance with a quiet, shared amusement that had nothing to do with the menu. Claire kept her eyes on her portfolio. What Takahashi had said, in easy, flowing Japanese, was this: "She moves like someone who's been trained to look competent. Watch, she'll hover too long and won't know when to disappear." Yamada smiled behind his water glass. Amara was at the neighboring service station, her back partially turned, writing down a note from table 11. Her hand moved across the pad without pausing. Her face gave nothing. When she returned to take their first round of orders, Takahashi looked up at her with the pleasant, empty expression of a man fully in control of the room. "We'll need a moment," he said in English, smooth and precise. His accent was slight, the product of years operating in international settings. "Of course." She stepped back a few feet, present but not crowding, available but not hovering. The exact calibration. Takahashi turned back to Yamada and resumed speaking in Japanese, this time about the menu itself, but the commentary threaded through it. "These places always hire for appearance. She probably doesn't speak anything beyond what they wrote on the specials board." The second executive, whose name was Bryce, an American, watching the exchange with mild interest, didn't understand the Japanese, but caught something in the tone. He glanced briefly at Amara and then back at his menu. Claire turned a page in her portfolio with deliberate focus. A few minutes later, Amara returned. "Are we ready to order? Or would you like me to walk through the evening's specials?" Takahashi looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, though not in the way that would have felt like recognition. It was more like appraisal. Quick, thorough, dismissive. "The specials," he said. She walked through them cleanly. The halibut preparation, a dry-aged duck breast with a miso citrus reduction, a seasonal mushroom dish that had come in from a supplier in Vermont. No stumbling, no filler phrases, no over-explaining. Clean and direct. When she finished, Takahashi spoke again, but this time in Japanese, addressing Yamada. "The miso reduction is a Western adaptation. The kitchen doesn't know what they're doing with it. They've probably never tasted an actual Japanese preparation." He paused, then said something further. "Ask her, but watch her face when she tries to answer." Yamada cleared his throat and looked at Amara with an expression of polite curiosity. The miso citrus reduction. Can you describe how the kitchen prepares it? The base is a traditional shiro miso, white miso, lower salt, fermented shorter. They balance it with a yuzu reduction rather than standard lemon, which keeps the brightness without sharpness. It's finished with a cold butter mount, served immediately off the heat. She paused. The kitchen sourced the yuzu domestically, so it's a lighter expression than what you'd find in Western Japan. If you prefer something more robust, the duck pairs well with the accompaniment served separately. There was a small silence. Yamada blinked once. Takahashi's expression shifted. Not much, but slightly. The same way a chess player's expression shifts when the board shows something unexpected. Then he resumed in Japanese. That was memorized. They briefed these servers before VIP tables. He smiled and picked up his menu again. Let's give her something she hasn't rehearsed. What came next was delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before, used language as a tool, not to communicate, but to exclude, to test, to diminish. Takahashi began placing his order in Japanese, not translating, not offering a bridge, just speaking directly, rapidly, as though Amara were a device he expected to malfunction. He ordered the duck, specified a particular sauce on the side, asked for a bread service with no butter, and requested a specific temperature for his water. Then, without changing his tone, he added something extra. Yet in the same fluid stream, that the duck should be prepared medium rare, bordering on rare, which was not on the menu and would require a specific kitchen instruction. He watched her face. Amara held her notepad. She looked at him with the same calm she'd carried since the beginning of the evening. "I want to make sure I have your order correctly," she said in English. "For clarification, did you want to specify a preparation for the duck beyond what's listed, or would you prefer the kitchen standard?" It was a professional ask, the right ask for any server who hadn't understood something. And it was exactly what Takahashi had been waiting for. He smiled, not unkindly, but with a particular satisfaction, and said in English, "I'm sorry, I thought I was clear." Then he turned to Yamada and said in Japanese, she didn't catch a word of it, "As expected." The table chuckled, soft, contained. The kind of sound that doesn't travel far, but lands hard when you're the one standing in front of it. From 3 tables away, Gerald glanced over. He couldn't hear the specifics, but he read the body language clearly enough. The slight shift in the table's posture, the restrained amusement directed toward the server, and shook his head once, the slow headshake of someone who had predicted this outcome. Danny, carrying a tray past the section, caught Amara's eye for half a second. His expression was tight with second-hand anxiety. Claire had stopped pretending to read her portfolio. Takahashi switched back to English and began reordering, this time more slowly, with the exaggerated clarity of someone explaining something to a child. He gave a slightly different version of the order than the one he'd given in Japanese. Not radically different, but different enough that if the kitchen prepared what he said now, it would conflict with what he'd said before. "I understand," Amara said, writing it down. She returned to the service station. The manager, Robert, materialized beside her with the practiced invisibility of someone who'd been watching from across the room. "How's the table?" he said quietly. "Fine." "They seem—" He stopped. "Are you confident on the order?" "Yes." He searched her face for uncertainty and didn't find any, which seemed to make him more uncertain. Kenji Takahashi is not a man who tolerates errors. "I know." Robert hovered for another moment, then peeled away. At the kitchen pass, Amara put in the order. Precise, detailed, and with a note flagged for Marco on the duck preparation. She'd written both versions of the instruction on her pad and quietly submitted the accurate one. Marco read the ticket, looked up at her, and she gave him the smallest nod. He didn't ask. Back at the table, the ordering continued. Takahashi worked through his wine selection with Yamada, discussing in Japanese, occasionally waving at Amara to approach, then not acknowledging her when she did, making her stand at the table's edge while he finished his sentence, then speaking at her rather than to her when he was ready. It was a rhythm designed to erode, not explosive, not dramatic, just a slow, patient wearing down. At one point, Bryce, the American executive, he'd shifted in his chair with the slightly uncomfortable energy of someone watching something unfold that he wasn't sure how to respond to. He caught Claire's eye briefly. She gave him nothing. The wine was ordered. The bread came. The first courses went out. Then, during the pause between courses, Takahashi set his fork down and said something that was not about the food at all. He spoke in Japanese to Yamada, but the words were calibrated to be heard by anyone who understood them. His tone was easy, conversational, the same voice he might have used to comment on the weather. What he said, translated, was, "It's interesting, isn't it? You put someone in a uniform and they think they've risen above their station, but you can always tell. It's in the way they hold themselves, that particular kind of reaching. They're performing competence rather than having it. You can see it in her eyes. She's guessing at everything." He reached for his wine glass. People like that always end up back where they started. It's not cruelty. It's just gravity. Claire set her fork down very carefully and looked at her plate. Yamada gave a quiet, neutral sound of acknowledgement, the sound of someone who agreed less than they were letting on. Amara had come back to the table with a small dish, a palate cleanser between courses, something light. She set it down on the left side, one at a time, precise and unhurried, moving around the table. When she reached Takahashi's place, she set the dish down. She did not immediately move away. She straightened. She looked at him, not with anger, not with hurt, with something still and clear that took a moment to name. Takahashi looked up from his glass and found her looking directly at him, and for just a beat, the width of a breath, something flickered behind his composed expression. Then he raised an eyebrow, mildly. "Is something wrong?" Amara was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then she turned and walked away. Behind her, the table was still. Gerald had drifted closer during the last exchange. He stepped beside Amara as she moved toward the service corridor. "You're off your game tonight," he said under his breath, not looking at her. "That table is going sideways, and you're standing there staring. You know what happens if Hale decides this service was a failure?" Amara didn't answer. "This isn't a table you want to lose," he added. "I can step in, take over, smooth it out. No shame in it." She looked at him then, one brief, level look. "I've got the table," she said. Gerald opened his mouth and then closed it. Something in her voice had closed a door he didn't remember opening. She walked back to the floor. The duck came out perfectly. Medium rare bordering on rare, exactly as Takahashi had specified in Japanese. The specification he'd never bothered to repeat in English. The one he delivered as a test. The one he had fully expected to go unmet. The plate was set in front of him, with the sauce separated, the bread already cleared, the water refreshed to the temperature he'd requested without anyone having to ask again. He looked at the plate. He looked at it for just a moment longer than a man simply admiring a well-prepared dish. Then he picked up his knife and fork and said nothing. The dinner moved through its middle stretch the way most dinners at tables like this one did. Conversation in clusters, wine refilled, the quiet machinery of the restaurant turning around them. But the texture of Takahashi's table was different from the others. There was an edge beneath it that hadn't dulled. If anything, as the meal progressed and the food met every specification without comment or complaint, that edge sharpened, because Takahashi was the kind of man who found it more irritating to be served well by someone he'd dismissed than to be served poorly by someone he'd already written off. He was working through the duck when he spoke again. This time, it wasn't a murmur to Yamada. It was louder, not enough to carry across the restaurant, but enough that it sat in the open air of the table, unambiguous in its intent. Oh, he spoke in Japanese, and what he said was directed nowhere specific and everywhere at once, the way a man speaks when he wants to perform certainty rather than feel it. She got lucky with the order. The kitchen probably flagged the preparation. These places coach their servers before big tables. She's running on instructions, not understanding. Watch her when the script runs out. Yamada said nothing this time. He picked up his wine glass. Bryce was looking at the table's centerpiece with the focused attention of a man who had decided to be somewhere else in his mind. Claire set her fork down with a small, deliberate click. Takahashi continued. His voice stayed easy, conversational, but the words turned sharper. He spoke about the restaurant's habit of hiring for optics. Hey, he said that diversity in service roles was a performance put on for a particular kind of guilty conscience. He said, and here his voice took on a musing quality as though he were thinking through something philosophical rather than saying something cruel, that some people moved through spaces they hadn't earned, trading on the discomfort of others who didn't want to be seen as the kind of person who noticed. She belongs somewhere smaller, he said. Somewhere she doesn't have to pretend. He cut a piece of duck and brought it to his mouth. The table was quiet, and then, from just behind his left shoulder, came a voice. It was not loud. It was not rushed. It was not the voice of someone who had lost their composure or found it necessary to raise any kind of flag. It was calm in the way that still water is calm, not because nothing is happening beneath the surface, but because whatever is beneath the surface is entirely in control. The voice spoke in Japanese. If you wanted proper service, you should have ordered correctly the first time. The fork in Yamada's hand stopped moving. Bryce looked up from the centerpiece. Takahashi turned his head. Amara stood at the edge of the table, not hovering, not intruding, but present in the way that made the space around her suddenly reorganize itself. She wasn't performing anger. She wasn't trembling with it either. Her hands were loose at her sides. Her expression was the same expression she'd worn all evening, composed, attentive, clear. The only thing that had changed was that she had chosen to speak, and chosen the language to speak in. And both of those choices landed in the room like two stones dropped into still water. The ripples moved outward immediately. Claire's eyes were wide, not with alarm, with something closer to recognition. The expression of someone watching a thing they had suspected was possible finally become real. Yamada placed his fork down on the plate with a sound that was very small in a room that had suddenly become very quiet. One of the tables nearby, a couple in their 50s who had been in soft conversation for the last 20 minutes, stopped talking. The man glanced over. His wife followed. Takahashi had not moved. His face had done something complicated in the half-second after Amara spoke, a sequence of things passing through it that didn't resolve into any single expression. The smile he'd been wearing for the last hour had gone. Not replaced by anger, not by embarrassment, replaced for the moment by nothing. A blankness that was more revealing than either of those things would have been, because it meant that for the first time all evening, he had not been ready. Amara continued. She spoke in Japanese still, and her Japanese was not the Japanese of someone who had memorized phrases or studied from a textbook. The construction was natural, the rhythm was unforced, and what she said carried the particular ease of someone who had spent real time inside a language rather than around it. She said that the order he had placed in Japanese at the beginning of the meal had included a preparation specification for the duck that differed from what he'd repeated in English 2 minutes later. Well, she said the kitchen had been given the Japanese version, the accurate version, because that was the order she had written down. She said the water temperature, the bread service, the sauce placement, all of it had been handled according to what he'd actually requested, not according to what he'd chosen to say out loud in a language he'd assumed she didn't speak. Then she paused. It was a short pause, the kind that has weight. I understood everything you said from the moment you sat down." The couple at the neighboring table had stopped even pretending not to listen. The woman's hand rested on the stem of her wine glass, unmoving. From across the restaurant, Robert Hale had gone very still near the host stand. He couldn't hear the words from where he stood, but he could read the posture of every person at that table, and what the posture said was that something had shifted, and it had shifted toward the server. Gerald was standing near the service corridor. His expression had moved through several phases in the last 30 seconds, and had arrived at something he hadn't expected to feel: genuine attention. Danny had stopped walking entirely, a tray held flat in both hands, watching. At the table, Takahashi had still not spoken. Amara's voice remained even. She moved through the full order, every item, every specification, every modification he had delivered in Japanese across the course of the evening, listing them in sequence precisely without consulting her notepad. The regional vocabulary he'd used, the specific verb forms, the particular construction he'd used when he'd said the word for rare versus medium rare. She reflected it back to him in the same register he'd used, not to mock it, but to demonstrate with complete clarity that she had heard all of it. Every word, from the beginning. She reached the end of the list. The room was very quiet. Then she said, in the same unhurried voice, "Would you like me to continue in Kyoto dialect, or shall we return to English?" It was not a taunt. The tone didn't allow for that reading. It was a question, specific, genuine, and entirely devastating in its precision, because it told him not only that she had understood what he'd said, but that she had recognized where in Japan the particular shape of his language had come from. That she knew him more clearly than he had ever intended to be known by a person he had decided within 30 seconds of being seated didn't matter. Yamada looked at his plate. Bryce exhaled once through his nose, a small, involuntary sound that carried more commentary than he probably intended. Claire looked at Amara with an expression that was not entirely professional and did not try very hard to make it so. Takahashi sat with both hands flat on the table on either side of his plate, the posture of a man who was making a decision about what to do next and had not made it yet. Amara looked at him. She was not gloating. There was no performance in her face, no satisfaction being offered for others to witness. What was, there was something quieter, an accounting, the straightforward, a complete accounting of a person who had let something run its full course and was now simply standing at the end of it. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she said, in English. And then she turned and walked back toward the service station, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if the last 2 minutes had been nothing more remarkable than refilling a glass. The restaurant noise resumed around her, slowly, unevenly, the way sound returns after something loud. Conversations restarted in pieces. Someone near the front laughed at something that had nothing to do with any of this. The machinery of the evening picked itself back up, but at table 7, nobody spoke for a long moment. Takahashi reached for his wine glass. His hand was steady, but he looked at it before he lifted it. A brief, private look. The kind you give something when you need a second to gather yourself and don't want anyone to see that you needed it. He drank. The rest of the meal passed in a kind of altered quiet. Not uncomfortable exactly, or not only uncomfortable. There was something else threaded through it. The two executives at the table had recalibrated. Bryce had straightened in his chair, was paying attention to things in a different way now. Yamada ate methodically and said very little. Claire had returned to her portfolio, but she turned the pages more slowly than before, and twice Amara caught her glancing toward the service station with an expression that was thinking something through. Takahashi ate his duck. He didn't say anything else in Japanese. When Amara came to the table, he watched her. Not the way he'd watched her before, not the survey of someone cataloging irrelevance. This was different. This was the look of a man reorienting a map. He was tracing something back, recalculating distances he'd measured wrong, and he was doing it without letting it show in anything but his eyes. Amara served the table through the remainder of the meal with the same precision she had shown all evening. Dessert menus were offered. 2 people ordered, 2 declined. The bill was handled through Robert, who appeared at the table near the end of the meal with the particular energy of someone who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then discarded it 3 times on the walk over. "I hope everything met your expectations this evening," Robert said, addressing Takahashi directly, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man managing several things at once. Takahashi looked up at him. "The service was adequate," he said. Robert began to say something further, something in the register of apology, the preemptive kind that managers offer when they're not sure what they're apologizing for but want to cover the possibility. And Takahashi stopped him. "I said adequate," he repeated. "That's sufficient." He returned to the small cup of tea that had appeared at his place without him having ordered it. Amara had noted 20 minutes earlier, that he'd glanced at the tea service on the neighboring table with something that read like mild longing, and had put in the request to the kitchen quietly. Robert withdrew. As the table settled the check and began the gradual process of concluding the evening, Amara was clearing the neighboring section. The restaurant had thinned out. It was past 9:30, and the kitchen was winding down. The floor felt different at this hour, more spacious, the urgency of peak service replaced by a slower, tiredness-edged rhythm. She was stacking bread plates onto a tray when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Gerald was standing a few feet away, his expression doing something she hadn't seen on it before. The usual architecture of his face, the slightly elevated chin, the particular set of his mouth that communicated perpetual mild judgment, had softened around the edges. Not completely, not into warmth, but into something that was at least reaching in that direction. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her. "You trained in that language?" he finally said. His voice was low. Pay no audience for it except the 2 of them. Amara continued stacking the plates. "I speak it." "That's not what I asked." She didn't answer. Gerald was quiet again. Then, "I was wrong about you." He said it the way people say things they've never said before, a little stiffly, without much grace, but meaning it. "I don't know what I was wrong about exactly, but I was." Amara looked at him briefly. "I know," she said. She picked up the tray and walked toward the kitchen. Near the entrance, as the party from Table 7 gathered their things, Claire broke away from the group on some quiet pretext and passed close to the service area. She wasn't heading anywhere specific. Amara clocked the drift immediately. Claire slowed as she passed. "That was," she started, and then seemed to decide something about how to finish. You didn't have to do that quietly. Most people wouldn't have." Amara set down the tray. "I wasn't doing it for most people." Claire held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, a small, genuine nod, and rejoined the group. Near the exit, Takahashi paused. He turned. The restaurant was quieter now, a few tables still finishing up, the light from the chandeliers doing less work than it had an hour ago. Amara was at the far end of the room, moving between tables, folding the close of service linens. Takahashi looked at her across the space. He spoke in Japanese, not to the room, not to anyone near him, not loudly, just clearly, in her direction. "Where did you learn that?" Amara looked up. She crossed the distance between them without hurrying. She stopped a few feet away and met his eyes with the same directness she'd shown all evening. "From someone who respected the language," she said, in Japanese. Then she held his gaze for a moment, just long enough, and turned back to her work. Takahashi stood at the entrance for a few seconds longer than necessary. His expression had moved through several more of those complicated sequences, and this time, one of them had snagged on something. A particular phrase, a particular way of holding it. Something about the answer had not landed the way he'd expected, and not because it was evasive, it was because it wasn't evasive at all. It was exact, and exact in this context meant something. He held that something in his expression for another breath. Then he walked out. In the back corridor, 3 minutes after Table 7 had cleared, though the kitchen staff were cleaning down their stations and the front-of-house team was doing the end-of-service wrap. Danny was rolling silverware at the prep table, moving on autopilot, when Amara came through with the last tray from her section. "That was wild," he said immediately, no preamble. "I caught about half of it from across the room, and I still can't." He stopped himself. "Are you good?" "I'm fine." He was being, whatever he was saying in Japanese, you could tell from the faces that it was. "I know what he was saying." Danny was quiet for a second. "Yeah," he said. "Obviously." He went back to rolling silverware. "Are you going to get in trouble for that?" Amara considered the question. "I don't think so." "Robert didn't pull you aside." "He tried." "I told him the table finished without complaint and the check cleared." Danny made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. "That's technically true." "It's completely true." She set the tray down and began sorting the linen into the bin. She moved with the same economy she always did. No wasted effort, no visible processing of what had happened an hour ago. To a casual eye, she looked like someone finishing a shift, which, in one sense, she was. In the corner of the prep area, Marco, the sous chef still in his apron, was drinking water and watching her. When she looked over, he raised his cup slightly. Not much, just enough. She gave him a small nod. Outside, the street in front of Aurelius was quieter now. A few cabs idled near the far corner. The last of the evening guests filtered out in clusters, coats on, conversations carrying through the cold air. Amara stepped out of the service entrance at 10:47, still in uniform, her bag over one shoulder. The night was clear and cold, the city noise reduced to that particular late evening register. Distant, persistent, but no longer urgent. She was 3 steps down the sidewalk when she stopped. There was a car. Not a cab, not the kind of car that waited near a restaurant entrance hoping for a fare. This was a black luxury sedan, positioned precisely at the edge of the service lane, engine idling in the way that said it had been there long enough to be comfortable waiting. The driver was standing outside it, not leaning on it, not checking a phone. Just standing, hands at his sides, looking in her direction. When she appeared, he moved to the rear door and opened it. Not in the way a rideshare driver opened a door, efficiently, impersonally, moving on to the next thing mentally before the passenger was even seated. He opened it with a particular posture, upright, deliberate, the posture of someone who had been told who they were picking up and understood what that meant. Behind her, the service entrance door was still settling closed. Through the small window set into it, 2 of the kitchen staff had drifted toward the glass, watching. Amara looked at the car. She looked at the driver. Then she walked toward it. And as she did, something shifted. It was subtle, the kind of thing that would be impossible to describe if you were asked about it later, impossible to point to in any single movement. But the Amara who walked across that narrow strip of pavement toward the open car door was not exactly the same as the Amara who had moved through Aurelius all evening. Her posture had always been good. Now it was something more than good. The slight professional compression she carried in a service environment, not a slouch, never a slouch, but a particular calibration that kept her from occupying more space than the job required, was gone. What replaced it was a straightness that came from somewhere deeper. She got in. The driver closed the door. Through the window of the service entrance, one of the kitchen staff said something to the other. The other one just shook his head, slowly. Inside the car, it was quiet and warm. Amara set her bag beside her on the seat and looked out the window as they pulled away from the curb. The restaurant lights shrank behind them. The streets widened as they moved away from the restaurant district. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, then answered. Yes. A pause. I met him. She listened for several seconds, her eyes tracking the city moving past the window. He hasn't changed. Another pause, longer. No, he doesn't know yet. She ended the call and put the phone face down on the seat beside her. Back inside Aurelius, the dining room lights had been reduced to their post-service setting, warmer, lower, the restaurant breathing out after a long evening. Robert was in his office doing his nightly notes. Danny had gone home. Gerald was finishing the last of the close-down checklist, working through it with slightly less efficiency than usual because part of his mind was still somewhere else. At the host stand, Claire stood beside Takahashi while the last of the team gathered near the entrance. She had waited until the others were far enough away before she leaned slightly toward him and spoke quietly. "She's not ordinary," she said. The way she handled that, it wasn't just language. She knew exactly what she was doing before she said a word. Takahashi looked at the space where the dining room opened into the back sections. He said nothing. "We should look into her," Claire said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, "I know." In a building across the city, 3 floors above a lobby that showed nothing of what was above it, a room was lit with the particular quality of light that comes from screens and lamps late at night in a space where the people inside have learned not to need windows. The people in that room were not many. 6. He seated around a table that was not large but was arranged like one that understood its own importance. There were laptops and folders and the specific kind of focused quiet that existed around people who were thinking about large things. The door opened. Amara walked in. She had changed. Not her clothes. She was still in the clothes she'd left the restaurant in, but the entirety of how she occupied space had shifted further. The composed, careful waitress was somewhere behind her now. What was in the room was someone else, or rather, the fuller version of the person the waitress had been a partial expression of. The people at the table looked up. The man at the far end, gray-haired, serious-faced, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where decisions became consequences, looked at her without surprise. But he had been expecting her. "Welcome back, Ms. Cole," he said. "The board is waiting." Amara pulled out the chair at the head of the table. She sat down, and she looked around at the people assembled there with the same clear, steady eyes she had turned on Kenji Takahashi across the floor of a restaurant, and she said, "Then let's begin." The board didn't waste time on pleasantries. That was one of the things Amara had come to appreciate about the people in this room. They were not the kind who filled silences with noise. They understood that silence was a resource, and they spent it carefully. There were 6 of them around the table, not counting Amara. The man at the far end, the one who had greeted her, was named Harold Stent, 63 years old. You're a former senior counsel for a mid-size private equity firm that had been strategically dissolved 8 years ago. To anyone who looked him up, he was retired. To the people in this room, he was the spine of a network that had been building quietly for longer than most corporate rivals would have thought to watch for. Beside him sat a woman named Patricia Okafor, mid-50s, still and precise, with the particular quality of attention that belonged to people who had spent long careers listening to what wasn't being said. She had spent 20 years in international trade law before stepping sideways into something less visible and considerably more consequential. The others, 3 men and 1 woman, ranging from their late 30s to early 60s, represented different nodes of the network: finance, media, infrastructure. Each of them had arrived at this table through a different path, but the path had led through the same point of origin. That point was a man named Daisuke Mori. "Tell us about tonight," Harold said. Amara folded her hands on the table. She didn't need notes. He arrived at 8, party of 4, himself, 2 corporate executives, and his assistant. He was exactly what the briefing indicated: composed surface, sharp eyes. He reads rooms quickly. She paused. He also uses language as a sorting mechanism. He decided what I was within 30 seconds of sitting down. And the rest of the evening? He spent 2 hours confirming a conclusion he'd already reached. She let that sit for a moment. By the end, he was reconsidering. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "How did he react when you responded in Japanese?" He went still. Amara's voice was even, not angry, recalibrating. He's too controlled for a public reaction, but the recalibration was real. When he left, he asked where I'd learned. I gave him the answer we discussed. Something passed through the room, brief, collective. Harold looked at her. "And?" "Something landed," she said. I don't know exactly which connection he made, but the answer triggered recognition. He was still processing it when he walked out. Harold sat back. He pressed the tips of his fingers together in the way he did when something confirmed a calculation rather than surprised him. "Good, that's what we needed." Across the table, Patricia pulled a slim folder toward her and opened it to a page she had clearly already read several times. "His team will investigate you," she said. It wasn't a question. "They'll start tonight." "I know. They'll find the surface records, low-income background, community college coursework, part-time employment history going back 4 years. Nothing that doesn't fit the picture he already decided on." "And the other records?" "Sealed. The language study in Osaka is documented under a different name. The consultancy work is buried 3 layers deep. The connection to Mori is not findable through any conventional search." Patricia closed the folder. "As far as Kenji Takahashi's research team is concerned, you are exactly what he thought you were before you opened your mouth." "Which will make him more curious," Harold said, "not less." Amara nodded. That was the design. The room moved into its working rhythm then, the kind of focused, unhurried efficiency that characterized every meeting she'd sat through in this space. They went through the status of 3 separate investment positions. They reviewed a set of communication logs that had come through one of Patricia's contacts inside a financial monitoring firm. They mapped the current state of Takahashi's next major deal, a large infrastructure acquisition in the Pacific Northwest, and the positions they had quietly established around it. None of what they were doing was illegal. That mattered to Amara, and it had mattered to the people who built this network before her. They operated through influence, through information, through the careful placement of value in positions that Takahashi's machine would eventually need or want. They didn't break laws. They used the same mechanisms that powerful people used. They had simply arranged to be holding the right cards in the right sequence before the hand was fully played. Daisuke Mori had taught her that. She didn't say his name during the meeting. She rarely did in this context, but he was present in everything, in the structure of how this board operated, in the particular philosophy that shaped their choices, in the reason any of them were in this room at all. When the meeting had covered what it needed to cover, Harold looked at her again. "There's one more thing." He nodded to the woman at the far end of the table, a younger member, early 40s, named Cassandra Webb, who handled communications and digital infrastructure for the network. Cassandra turned her laptop toward the center of the table. On the screen was a photograph. It was a security camera image, time-stamped from earlier that evening, taken from a camera positioned above the entrance of Aurelius. The image was clear enough. It showed Amara stepping out of the service entrance, and it showed the black car at the curb, and it showed the driver opening the door. "This went up on a private financial news aggregator 45 minutes ago," Cassandra said. Someone inside the restaurant shared it. The caption asks who the waitress is. Amara looked at the image. How wide? Small circulation, niche, the kind of thing Takahashi's intelligence team monitors. Cassandra paused. They've already seen it. The room was quiet. So his investigation started faster than we expected, Patricia said. It started the moment she answered him, Harold replied. He didn't sound concerned. He sounded like a man watching a chess piece move exactly where he'd predicted it would. He looked at Amara. This isn't a problem, it's an acceleration. Amara looked at the photograph on the screen for another moment, herself in uniform stepping toward an open door, caught between two versions of herself in a single frame. I know, she said. She looked up. Let him dig. He won't find what he's looking for. She paused. But he'll find enough to keep looking. And while he's looking, he won't be watching what we're actually doing. Nobody disagreed. The meeting closed at 12:40. The others gathered their things and filed out in ones and twos, the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to move without leaving a visible trail. Harold was last, and he paused near the door. You did well tonight, he said. Simply, a without performance. Amara had her bag over her shoulder again. She looked at him for a moment. He called people like me decorative, she said. He said we move through spaces we haven't earned. Harold held her gaze. Daisuke used to say that the most dangerous thing you could be in a room full of powerful people was someone they had already decided didn't matter. He paused. You made him look at you tonight. The rest follows from that. He left. Amara stood alone in the room for a moment. The screens dimmed, the city quiet beyond the walls. She thought about a restaurant in Osaka 9 years ago. She thought about a man with careful hands and a particular way of explaining things, not as lessons, but as conversations. She thought about how that man had spent the last 4 years of his life trying to rebuild something that had been taken apart piece by piece by the kind of power that moved too fast for ordinary mechanisms to track. She turned off the last lamp. She walked out. Meanwhile, across the city in a hotel suite on the 38th floor, a laptop screen was the only light in the room. Kenji Takahashi sat at the desk with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, the posture of a man who had moved from public mode into working mode. Beside the laptop was a glass of water, untouched. On the screen was a document his research team had compiled in the 2 hours since he'd left the restaurant. It was thorough, as their work always was. His team was good. They had been responsible for surfacing information on dozens of individuals over the years, and they were fast. The document told him the following. Amara Cole, 26, born in Chicago. Mother listed as a home care worker. Father not present in records. Attended a community college for 2 semesters, did not complete. Employment history showed a sequence of service industry jobs, a hotel in the Loop, 2 other restaurants before Aurelius, a brief gap. Current residence was listed as an apartment in a neighborhood that corresponded to her declared income level. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained what had happened tonight. He read it twice. He was thorough by instinct. He did not assume that the absence of obvious information meant the absence of important information. The two were often different things. He picked up his phone and called Claire. She answered on the second ring. She had clearly been awake. The records are clean, he said. Too clean. A brief pause. What do you mean? People who grew up the way this document indicates carry a particular kind of paper trail. Small things, applications, program enrollments, community records, school reports, layered, textured. He paused. This is smooth. Claire was quiet for a moment. You think it's been managed? I think someone knew we would look. He set the phone down against his shoulder and scrolled again. There are also gaps. A 14-month window 6 years ago where employment records don't connect to residence records. A name attached to a language program in Osaka that was administratively closed. He paused. The program was closed 4 years ago. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then, Osaka. Yes. The silence between them was the kind that happened when two people arrived at the edge of the same thought at the same time. What do you want me to do? Claire asked. Takahashi looked at the document. He thought about a restaurant in Osaka almost a decade ago. He thought about a man he had not spoken to in 4 years and the last conversation they'd had, and the shape of a phrase that a waitress in Chicago had used tonight that had no business being that specific. From someone who respected the language. Dig deeper, he said. Don't use the standard team. Use Mercer. He paused. And find out everything you can about Daisuke Mori's last known associates. He ended the call. He sat for a long time in the dark room. 9 years ago, Osaka was different from the city it had become. Or perhaps it was only that Amara had been different. 17 years old and arriving with nothing except a scholarship from an international cultural exchange foundation that barely covered her housing. A second-hand Japanese dictionary with half the pages annotated by whoever had owned it before, and the particular reckless focus that sometimes lived in young people who had decided, without anyone's permission, to become someone specific. She had come to study. The official designation was a language immersion program. But the real education had started 3 weeks in, when she had wandered into the wrong building on a Tuesday afternoon, a converted office near the Shinsaibashi district, and found herself in a room where a man was giving a talk to about 12 people about the way dominant corporate structures absorbed smaller competitors by making them feel grateful for the absorption. His name was Daisuke Mori. He was 61 at the time. Lean, with a precise way of speaking and an unhurried quality that made everything he said feel considered rather than spontaneous. He ran a small investment advisory firm, genuinely small, not the kind of small that was actually large and wanted to seem approachable. He operated in the space between mid-size enterprises and the institutional capital that was slowly learning how to swallow them. He helped the former understand the latter before it was too late to make a choice. He was not famous. He did not appear in the financial press. He had made a deliberate practice of existing slightly to the side of the spotlight, which was, he would later tell Amara, the most useful place to stand if you wanted to see clearly. After the talk, most people had left. Amara had stayed because there were 3 things he'd said that she didn't fully understand, and she had come too far to leave a room with unresolved questions. She had asked them, he had answered them. Then he had asked her a question back, not condescendingly, not as a test in the way Takahashi's tests were constructed, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who had not expected to find a 17-year-old black American girl in that particular room. Or asking those particular questions in Japanese that was 2 months old and already more structurally sound than most people managed in 2 years. The conversation had lasted an hour and 40 minutes. She came back the following Tuesday. Over the course of the 14 months that followed, Daisuke Mori became the most significant teacher of her life. Not because of what he knew, though he knew a great deal, but because of how he knew it. He did not hold information as a prize or a credential. He held it as a tool, and he taught her to do the same. He taught her Japanese the way someone who loved a thing teaches it, not from textbooks, but from context, from literature, from the particular rhythms of how different regions shape the same language into something locally specific. He also taught her business, strategy. Was the way power moved through institutional structures, how it pooled, where it snagged, what made it vulnerable, and what made it durable. He taught her through conversation, through case studies, through the occasional meeting she was allowed to sit in on, silently, at the back of a room. She watched how he listened, how he let people talk themselves into positions, how he asked a question at the exact moment a question would do the most work. She was a student. He was not pretending to be anything other than a teacher. But there was someone else who moved through Daisuke's orbit during those 14 months, someone who came to the firm twice, stayed for 2 days each time, and had a series of meetings that Amara was not invited to attend. Kenji Takahashi. He was 46 then, already powerful, already building the empire that would make his name synonymous with a particular brand of aggressive, precision-engineered corporate expansion. He and Daisuke had a relationship that went back further than Amara ever fully knew. They had been associates in the early days of Takahashi's rise, when Daisuke's network and expertise had been a genuine resource for someone who needed connections more than capital. By the time Amara arrived in Osaka, that relationship had changed. She didn't know how. Daisuke never said, and she didn't ask. But she felt the texture of it in the way he spoke carefully when Takahashi's name came up, and in the way the meetings happened behind closed doors in a way his other meetings didn't. The second visit, near the end of her second year, she had been returning books to the shelf in the hallway adjacent to the main meeting room when she heard enough. Not everything, not the full shape of what was being negotiated, but enough to understand that Takahashi was not there to seek advice. He was there to make an offer, a particular kind of offer, framed as collaboration, that was actually an absorption. He wanted Daisuke's network, his access, his connections to certain institutional investors that Takahashi's machine had not yet been able to reach through conventional approaches. He wanted it folded into his own operation. He was willing to compensate, generously. What he was not willing to do was preserve it as a separate thing. What he was not willing to do was allow Daisuke to continue operating independently, which was the only condition under which Daisuke would have agreed to anything. She had not heard Daisuke's final answer. She had moved away from the door when she heard footsteps. But she had seen Takahashi leave, and she had seen his face, and his face told her the answer had been no. 6 months later, Daisuke's firm was gone. Not through any single action, nothing so direct. It happened the way things happened in that particular world, through the careful withdrawal of support from several directions at once. Partnerships dissolved. A key institutional connection quietly redirected its relationship. 2 junior members of Daisuke's network took positions elsewhere within weeks of each other. Referrals that had been reliable stopped coming. Daisuke was not ruined. He was rendered small. And for a man who had spent 40 years building something on the principle that small things, carefully tended, could stand up to large ones, being rendered small was its own particular kind of destruction. Amara had been back in Chicago for 2 months when she found out. She was 19. She had a part-time job at a hotel near Michigan Avenue and a set of skills that no resume she had constructed had found a way to honestly represent. She called Daisuke. He answered with the same unhurried quality she had always known in him, and when she asked directly what had happened, he told her. He did not call it what she called it. He didn't use the word she had in her mind. He said that he had encountered the limits of operating outside a protection structure, and that the lesson had been expensive, and that it was not the kind of lesson that needed to be repeated. "What do you do with it?" she had asked. He had been quiet for a moment. Then, "You decide whether it made you smaller or larger." She had not forgotten that. In the years between that phone call and tonight, Amara had made a series of choices that were not visible on any record anyone would think to search. She had stayed in service work deliberately, not because it was the only option available to her, but because it was the right position for what she was building. Service roles were invisible in the way that mattered most. They placed you in rooms where people spoke freely, because they had already decided you weren't listening. She was always listening. She had made connections carefully. She had moved money carefully. She had learned to read the particular architecture of corporate deals the way Daisuke had taught her, by watching where the value really sat, not where the announcement said it did. Harold Stent had found her 3 years ago through a contact who knew her work. He hadn't recruited her so much as recognized her, recognized that she had already built, independently, the same kind of lateral network that his own group had been constructing. The combination had made both efforts more powerful. They had spent 2 years doing research. They had spent 1 year positioning. And then Kenji Takahashi had announced the Pacific Northwest deal, and they had begun to move. The restaurant had not been random. Aurelius was a place Takahashi visited twice a year when he was in Chicago. His assistant always booked it in advance. Harold's contact had confirmed the reservation 3 weeks out. Amara had taken the job at Aurelius 14 months ago, well before the deal was announced, well before they knew he would come, because the best positions were never reactive. She had waited, and when the reservation appeared on the calendar, she had made sure she was assigned to the floor. The rest of it, the dismissal, the Japanese, the escalating arrogance, she had not planned. She had not needed to. She had known it was coming because she had watched him from a distance for 6 years, and she understood how he operated. He did not need to be provoked into that behavior. He brought it with him. All she had needed to do was be present and composed and speak when the moment was right. And the moment had been right. The following morning, Claire arrived at Takahashi's suite at 7:30 with 2 cups of coffee and a folder she had stayed up assembling. He was already at the desk. "Mercer came back fast," she said, setting the folder in front of him. "There's a connection to a man named Harold Stent. Former private equity counsel dissolved his firm 8 years ago. He appears in the background of 3 separate entities, a small infrastructure fund, a media advisory group, a real estate LLC. None of them are large enough to register as significant on their own." Takahashi opened the folder. "But," he said. He heard a but in her voice. "Together, they represent positions in 3 of the 4 companies involved in your Pacific Northwest acquisition." She paused. The positions were established over the past 18 months, all minority stakes, none of them triggering disclosure requirements. Takahashi was quiet. He looked at the page in front of him. Then he turned to the next one. "Amara Cole appears in connection with the Media Advisory Group," Claire continued. "Not by name in any official capacity, but Mercer found a shared address history, a business registration 2 years ago, quietly dissolved, filed under a different name. The connection is thin." Another pause. "But it's there." Takahashi set the folder down. He looked at the window, the city gray and cool in the morning light. He thought about a restaurant dining room, a woman standing at the edge of a table with her hands at her sides. The specific, careful precision of her answer when he had asked where she had learned Japanese. Not a deflection, not a performance, but an exact answer that was also, if you knew what to listen for, a message from someone who respected the language, not from classes, not from study, from a person, a specific person who had a specific relationship to the language and to him. He had carried that phrase out of the restaurant with him. He had turned it over in the car and again in the hotel and again at 3 in the morning when he had stopped pretending he was going to sleep. He knew who had taught her. He had known since last night. "There's one more thing," Claire said. She reached forward and turned to the last page in the folder. Mercer found a medical record. Not detailed, just a flag. Daisuke Mori was hospitalized 14 months ago. Cardiac episode. He recovered, but his mobility has been limited since. She paused. "He's been living quietly in Kyoto." Takahashi looked at that page for a long time. He thought about a man with careful hands and an unhurried way of explaining things. He thought about the last conversation they had had. Not the professional one, the one that had preceded it, brief and unguarded, the kind of conversation that only happened between people who had known each other long enough to drop the architecture for a few minutes. He remembered something Daisuke had said about the nature of leverage, that real leverage was never about what you could take, only about what someone else could not afford to lose. He had thought at the time that Daisuke was talking about business. He was looking at a young woman in a restaurant. She had spent years. She had built something. Once she had placed herself in a room where she knew he would eventually sit, and she had waited, and she had let him underestimate her, and she had let him embarrass himself, and then she had spoken. All of it, every piece of it, was Daisuke. Takahashi stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The city was beginning its morning in the particular incremental way cities did, lights accumulating, movement thickening, the machinery of the day assembling itself from nothing into something. "Set up a meeting," he said. Claire looked at him. "With Amara Cole," he said. "Not here, not the restaurant." He paused. "Somewhere neutral." He looked at his reflection in the glass for a moment. "And tell her I'll come to wherever she prefers." When the message reached Amara, she was sitting in the kitchen of her apartment eating toast and reading a physical newspaper, one of the small daily habits she'd kept since Osaka, since Daisuke had insisted that there were things you noticed in print that you didn't notice on a screen. Her phone was on the table. She saw Claire's name and the brief message, and she read it once and then set the phone face down and finished her toast. Then she picked it up again and typed a reply. She sent it. Then she called Harold. "He wants a meeting," she said when he answered. A pause. "When?" "Soon. He's not in a position to wait." She looked out the kitchen window at the alley below, a narrow strip of gray morning between two buildings. "He found the stent connection. We expected that. He found the medical record, too." She paused. He knows about Mori." Harold was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" He didn't say it. He didn't have to. She folded the newspaper. He used the word neutral when he asked for the meeting location, and he said he'd come to where I preferred. She let that sit. He's not coming to negotiate. He's coming because he finally understands who he's actually been dealing with. Another pause. Then Harold said quietly, "And now?" Amara set the newspaper on the table. She looked at it, the front page, the headlines, the ordinary machinery of the world going about its business. "Now," she said, "we finish it." The building Amara chose was not impressive from the outside. That was deliberate. It sat on a quiet block in the West Loop, between a printing shop that had been there since the 90s and a Vietnamese restaurant that did most of its business at lunch. The building itself was 4 stories, brick, unremarkable. The lobby had a security desk and an elevator and a directory board with names that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been given context. The kind of building that people walked past without registering. Harold's network used the 3rd floor, had for 2 years. There was no sign on the door. Amara arrived 40 minutes before the meeting time she had given Claire. She sat at the table in the main room with a cup of coffee and went through everything once, not because she needed to review it, but because she had learned from Daisuke that the time before a significant conversation was not dead time. It was the time you used to decide what you would not say, which was always more important than deciding what you would. Harold had offered to be present. She had declined. Patricia had offered to be present. She had also declined. This was not a board meeting. It was not a negotiation in the formal sense. What it was, exactly, she had not put a name to. But she knew it required her to be alone in the room when Takahashi arrived, because some things only happened at the correct scale, and adding people to this particular conversation would change its scale into something that served a different purpose. She was here for the truth, for her own, and possibly for his. Whether he was capable of it remained to be seen. At 10:17, Claire called to say they were 4 minutes out. At 10:22, the elevator opened. Takahashi walked in alone. No Claire, no Yamada, no executives. He had come exactly as she had, one person, a room, a conversation. She noted that. It was a choice that said something, and he would have known it said something, which meant he had made it deliberately. He was dressed more quietly than he had been at the restaurant. A dark jacket, no tie, the kind of clothes that communicated seriousness without display. His eyes moved through the room once, the same survey she had observed at the restaurant, and then settled on her. She did not stand. She gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down." He sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The room was still, the building quiet around them, the city muffled to almost nothing by the walls. Then Takahashi said in Japanese, "You planned this." Amara looked at him. "You created the conditions for it," she said, also in Japanese. He received that without reaction. The restaurant, the job, 14 months. He paused. "That's patience. You taught me the value of positioning." She let that sit. Indirectly. Something moved through his expression, not defensiveness, something more considered. "Daisuke taught you that." "Daisuke taught me most things worth knowing." Takahashi placed both hands flat on the table, not a gesture of surrender, not a power move, simply the posture of a man who had decided to stop managing his own presentation and let the conversation go where it needed to go. It was the most human she had seen him look. "How is he?" he asked. The question surprised her. It not because she hadn't expected him to know about the cardiac episode, Mercer's research had clearly gotten there, but because of how he asked it, quietly, without the clinical remove she would have expected. "Recovering," she said, slowly. Takahashi nodded once. Silence. "You want me to say I'm responsible for what happened to him," he said. It was not a question, but it wasn't a statement either. It was the verbal equivalent of placing something on the table and waiting to see what she did with it. "I want you to be honest about what happened," Amara said. "Whether you say it or not is your business." "I made business decisions," he said. The words were measured. The market shifted around him. "I can't be held responsible for—" "You withdrew support from 4 separate relationships simultaneously," she said. Her voice was level. Not heated, not cold, just direct, in the way that made heat unnecessary. "Within a 6-month window after he declined your acquisition offer." She paused. "That's not the market shifting, that's architecture." Takahashi looked at her. She looked back. "You built something," she continued. "That's real, the scale of what you've done, I'm not dismissing it. But you built it on the assumption that the people beneath you on any given structure either didn't notice what was happening or couldn't do anything about it if they did." She paused. Daisuke noticed. He just didn't have the leverage at the right time. "And you do," Takahashi said. "Yes." The word landed cleanly. No elaboration, no performance around it, just the fact of it, set down between them. Takahashi's jaw shifted slightly, the micro-movement of a man absorbing something and recalibrating. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "The Pacific Northwest acquisition," he said. 3 of the 4 anchor companies have significant minority positions held by entities connected to Harold Stent's network, Amara said. "Not majority, nothing that forces a legal disclosure, but enough that when those positions move in coordination, the deal's risk profile changes materially." She paused. "Your institutional backers are conservative. They don't like surprises. If the risk profile on the acquisition shifts in the weeks before close, 2 of the 3 will request a valuation review, which delays the timeline, which exposes the leverage assumptions the deal is built on," she said. "The acquisition is priced on a forward revenue model that depends on infrastructure permits that haven't cleared yet. If the timeline slips by 60 days, 2 of those permits expire and have to be refiled." She let that settle. "You'd get the deal eventually, but not on the terms you've announced, and not before your Q3 investor presentation." Takahashi was quiet for a long moment. This was the part she had prepared for most carefully, not the confrontation, but what came after it. The confrontation was easy. She had been ready for that since Osaka. What required more precision was this: sitting across from him with all the leverage clearly in view and deciding what to do with it. "You're not here to destroy the deal," he said. He was working it out as he spoke, reading her the way she had read him at the restaurant, with the full attention of someone who had finally decided the subject was worth reading carefully. "If you wanted to destroy it, you wouldn't have arranged a meeting." "No." "Then what do you want?" Amara looked at him steadily. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Not for my benefit, for yours." He waited. "You've been operating for 30 years on the principle that scale is protection," she said. "That if you become large enough, the people affected by your decisions become too small to matter, too small to reach you, too small to be worth accounting for." She paused. Daisuke was small. The people his network served were small. The damage done to them didn't register in any report you read. Because nothing in the structure you built was designed to register it. She looked at him directly. "But it happened. It was real. And the cost of it wasn't carried by your balance sheet. It was carried by people." Takahashi did not look away. "I'm not asking you to feel guilty," she said. "I'm asking you to see it. There's a difference." The room held that for a moment. Then Takahashi said, carefully, "And if I see it, what does that change?" "It changes what you do next," she said, "which changes what we do next." He studied her. "You're offering terms." "I'm offering a conversation," she said. "The terms come from what we decide the conversation means." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't fill the silence. Daisuke had taught her about this too. That silence in a significant conversation was not dead space. It was where the real thinking happened. You didn't interrupt it. You let it work. When Takahashi finally spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not broken, not soft in the way that would have been a performance, just stripped of the particular hard shine that it had carried all through the restaurant and into the beginning of this meeting. "He was the only person in my early years who told me the truth," he said, "not what I wanted to hear, what was actually true." He paused. "When I made the offer, I told myself it was the right structure for both of us, that he'd benefit." Another pause. "I knew when he declined that I was going to let him lose what he'd built. I knew it before I walked out of that room." He looked at his hands on the table. "I told myself it was business." Amara looked at him. She said nothing. "It wasn't only business," he said. She heard the weight of it, not a plea, not a performance, just a fact delivered by a man who had been carrying it long enough to be tired of the shape it had inside him. She gave it the space it needed, a full breath, maybe two. Then she said, "Then let's start there." The meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. When Takahashi walked out and took the elevator down, Claire was waiting in the car outside. She looked at his face when he got in, and she had known him long enough to know when something had changed, not just shifted tactically, but actually changed. She didn't ask. He looked out the window as they pulled away. "Get me Daisuke Mori's contact information," he said. "Not a third party, his direct line." Claire wrote it down without comment. 3 weeks passed. They were not quiet weeks, not for Takahashi's operation, not for Harold's network, not for the machinery of the Pacific Northwest deal, which moved through its prescribed timeline with the particular grinding patience of large financial structures. But on the surface, the weeks looked ordinary. Deals processed, meetings happened, press releases went out. Numbers shifted in increments that only mattered to people whose job it was to watch for them. Beneath that surface, things were different. 2 of the minority positions held by entities in Harold's network were quietly restructured. Not liquidated, restructured. Their terms adjusted in a way that removed the pressure point from Takahashi's acquisition timeline. The risk profile of the deal stabilized. The institutional backers who had been edging toward a valuation review request pulled back from that edge. The deal moved forward, not unchanged. The terms had been modified in a series of conversations between Harold's legal team and Takahashi's. Conversations that were not announced and did not need to be. What had been a clean, aggressive acquisition structured entirely around Takahashi's leverage became something more balanced, a framework that acknowledged the existing stakeholders in the affected companies, that included provisions for the infrastructure communities whose permits underpinned the deal's revenue model, that built in review mechanisms that made future pressure points less likely to become crises. It was not a revolution. Nobody was going to write a news article about it. But it was real. And it was different from what would have happened without the last several weeks, and the people whose working conditions and community infrastructure it affected would eventually feel the difference, even if they never knew why it existed. Amara reviewed the final term sheet on a Thursday morning at her kitchen table, with coffee going cold beside her laptop, and the same physical newspaper folded beneath her elbow. She read through it carefully, the way Daisuke had taught her to read anything that mattered, not for what it said, but for what it assumed, what it took for granted, where the weight sat. She read it twice. Then she closed the laptop and called Harold. "It holds," she said. A pause. "You're satisfied?" She thought about the word. Satisfied was not quite the right shape for what she felt. It was something more complicated, something that included the satisfaction of a thing completed, but also the particular soberness that came from having spent years getting to a moment and then arriving in it and finding that it was both more and less than you had imagined, more real, less dramatic. "It's what it needed to be," she said. Harold made a sound of quiet agreement. "The board wants to meet next week." "I'll be there." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the kitchen, quiet. Outside, the city went about its morning. A delivery truck idled in the alley. Somewhere 2 floors up, a door opened and closed. She thought about Daisuke. She had spoken to him 4 days earlier, the first time since the night of the restaurant, the first time she had told him directly what had been happening. She had called from the same kitchen, late at night, and he had answered on the 3rd ring in the way he always did, unhurried, as though calls came at predictable intervals, and this was simply the next one. She had told him about the restaurant, about the Japanese, about Takahashi's face. He had listened without interrupting, which was his way, had always been his way, and when she finished, he had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said, in the particular dry tone she had not heard in too long, "You used the Kyoto dialect." "I did." "That was a little theatrical." She had laughed, actually laughed, the kind that came from somewhere deep and real and surprised her slightly. "I know." "Good," he had said. "Theater has its place." She had told him about the meeting in the West Loop building, about what Takahashi had said, about the moment when his voice had lost its hard shine. Daisuke had been quiet for longer after that. "He was a good man once," he finally said. "Not uncomplicated, not without ambition, but good, in the way that people are good before they decide that the cost of remaining so is too high." A pause. "I always wondered if he knew that about himself." "I think he did," Amara said. "I think he's been knowing it for a long time." Another pause. Then, gently, "What did you tell him?" "That we'd start there." Daisuke had said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's right." That had been 4 days ago, and now here she was, on a Thursday morning. With a term sheet on her laptop that represented the end of the operational chapter of something that had begun 9 years ago in a building near the Shinsaibashi district with a 17-year-old girl and a man who had too many books and too little interest in being famous. She stood up, rinsed her coffee cup, and pulled on her jacket. The second meeting with Takahashi happened 12 days after the first. He had requested it, a brief note through Claire, direct and without ceremony, asking if she had time. She had said yes and given the same building, and this time she had let Harold be present because the first meeting had been for truth, and this one was for record. Takahashi arrived the same way he had the first time, alone, quietly dressed. He acknowledged Harold with a nod, the nod of a man who recognized a counterpart and was prepared to deal with him as one. They sat. The tone was different from the first meeting. The first had been excavation, digging down through the layers of what had been performed and decided and denied until they hit something real. This one was construction, measured, careful, realistic. Harold led most of it, with the precise, unhurried quality of a man who had done this before and knew where the load-bearing points were. Takahashi engaged seriously, not defensively, not with the particular corporate deflection that Amara had expected to see at least some of. He pushed back in two places where he had genuine objections, and both objections were legitimate, and they were worked through. Amara spoke less than she had at the first meeting. This was intentional. She had said what she needed to say to Takahashi directly, person to person, in the West Loop building 3 weeks ago. What was happening now was the institutional expression of that, and it needed to be built between the institutions involved, not carried personally. Near the end of the meeting, there was a pause in the conversation, and Takahashi looked at her. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Not for the record." Harold glanced at her. She gave him a small nod. "Go ahead." Takahashi said, "When you answered me in Japanese in the restaurant, my first thought was not embarrassment. My first thought was recognition." He paused. "I heard him in how you constructed the sentence. The particular verb form, the pacing." He looked at her steadily. "I knew before I asked you. I already knew who had taught you." Amara held his gaze. "Why did you ask then?" she said. "Because I wanted to hear you say it." He paused. "And because I wanted to know if you would." She thought about that for a moment. "What did it tell you? That I said it the way I did?" "That you were proud of where you came from," he said. "That you weren't going to pretend otherwise, even in a room where pretending might have been the safer choice." He paused. Daisuke always said that the way someone spoke about their teachers told you everything about their character. The room was very quiet. Amara looked at this man, 55 years old, powerful in ways that most people never became, capable of the particular cruelty that came from treating people as instruments, and capable, apparently, also of this, sitting in a room and saying a true thing about someone they both knew and respected, without positioning it, without making it serve some other purpose. "He said the same thing about you," she said, early on, before everything. Takahashi received that without speaking. He just nodded, once, slowly. Harold cleared his throat gently. "Shall we close out the remaining terms?" They did. Amara did not go back to Aurelius as a waitress. She had known, the night she walked out to the black car, that that version of things was finished. 14 months was long enough. The positioning had served its purpose. There was no reason to return to the floor, and several reasons not to, the most important being that the story she was now part of was too large to be compressed back into a section of tables and a folded notepad. But 3 weeks after the second meeting, on a Thursday evening, she walked into Aurelius through the front entrance. Robert Hale saw her come in, and his expression did 3 different things in quick succession: surprise, recalibration, the particular attentiveness of a man who had spent the last few weeks quietly revising his understanding of a former employee. He came toward her immediately. "Ms. Cole, I'm not here on business," she said pleasantly. "I just need 5 minutes in the dining room." He stepped aside. The restaurant was in the middle of its dinner service. The chandeliers were doing their work. The tables were full. The clink and murmur and warm light of a room full of people eating well and talking and being for a few hours exactly where they wanted to be. She stood for a moment and took it in. Then she heard something from the far side of the room, a table near the window. 4 people, expensively dressed, midway through their meal. The dynamic was immediately readable. At the head of the table, a heavy-set man in a dark blazer, late 40s, with the ease of someone accustomed to having an audience. Across from him, a young woman in her first or second year of waitressing, new, slightly anxious, holding a notepad with both hands. The man was speaking to his companions about something that was ostensibly about the menu but was actually about the waitress, the way certain people spoke, angling the performance toward the table while the target was present and unable to respond. The companions laughed softly. One of them glanced at the young woman with the brief, apologetic look of someone who was complicit and knew it. The young waitress's jaw was tight. Her posture had contracted slightly, the invisible compression of someone making themselves smaller, which was the body's instinctive response to being made to feel that way. Amara walked across the restaurant. She did not rush. She did not perform urgency. She walked with the same economy of movement she had always had in this room, precise, unhurried, taking up exactly the space she chose to take up, and no more. She stopped beside the table. The man looked up. She looked at him pleasantly, not aggressively, not with the elevated social register of someone performing authority, but with the simple, grounded directness of a person who had decided what they were going to say and saw no reason to dress it up. "Speak respectfully," she said. "You never know who's listening." The table went quiet. The man blinked. "Excuse me?" Amara looked at him calmly. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. The words had landed exactly where she'd placed them, and the table had heard them, and the young waitress beside her had heard them, and the slight shift in the young woman's posture, the small, involuntary straightening that happened when someone you didn't expect to stand beside you did, had already happened. She looked at the young waitress. "Take your time with them," she said quietly. "You're doing fine." The young woman looked at her, just for a second, just long enough for something to pass between them that didn't require words, and gave the smallest, most genuine nod. Amara turned and walked back through the restaurant. She passed the table she had worked for 14 months. She passed the service station where she had stood for hours, reading the room, watching, listening. She passed the kitchen doors behind which Marco had turned a plate the right way at her quiet instruction, and the corridor where Gerald had admitted something true in a low voice, and the spot near the entrance where she had first seen Kenji Takahashi walk in and rearrange the room without raising his voice. She walked through the front door. Outside, the night was clear. The city was doing its evening thing, cabs and pedestrians and lit windows, and the particular texture of Chicago in autumn, when the air had an edge, but the energy of the city hadn't pulled inward yet. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed it in. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from a number she didn't have saved. She read it. It was 4 lines, written in Japanese. The construction was formal but not cold, the register of a man who had been taught once how to write in a language that required attention to the space between what you said and how you said it. The message said that he had placed a call to Kyoto that morning, that the call had been difficult in the way that conversations were difficult when they carried the weight of years, that it had gone better than he had expected, that he thought she should know. It was signed with a single character, his name. Amara stood on the sidewalk outside Aurelius and read the message twice. Then she looked up at the city, at the lit windows and the moving cabs, and the unremarkable, extraordinary fact of thousands of lives going on simultaneously, in each one carrying its own weight of what had been done and what had been left undone and what might yet be made right. She typed back 3 words. In Japanese. Thank you. Good. She put her phone in her pocket and started walking. Not toward the black car. There was no car tonight. Just her, and the sidewalk, and wherever the evening went from here. She didn't look back. If the people who underestimated you knew everything you were quietly becoming, would they have treated you differently? Or does that say more about them than it ever did about you? Like and subscribe for more stories that remind you the quietest person in the room is rarely the smallest.